Welcome to the O and O Show. I am your host, Colton Fetter at Volton Vetter on social media. If you clicked on this video, you might be thinking, what is this? I've never heard of this before. The O and O Show. It's a catchy name, but I've never heard of it. How have I never heard of it? Well, that is because this is the first ever episode of the show. You're not hallucinating. The big number one in the title and thumbnail is for real. This is the first ever episode. And as I'm pitching this, as I'm pitching the Ono show to my friends, to my colleagues, to my professors, they're saying, what is the Ono show? What does that mean? Before we get into the explanation, the Ono show aims to be your ground zero, no pun intended, actually pun massively intended, for college football media, news, analytics, all of the above. So you're going to come here if you want to know anything and everything about college football media. There's a lot in store for the future. So if you want to subscribe and witness the growth, hit the subscribe button and follow at ONO Sports on Twitter. That's all we have for now. So the ONO show, what does that mean? The most famous saying for coaches, players, is act like the score is nothing to nothing, O to O. Coming in at halftime, you're up, you're down, doesn't matter. That is the mantra we want to live by. We want our backs against the wall. We want to be successful. We want to make something of this. And that is the mantra I feel like we should all aspire to have. All of us should aspire to have that mantra. It's a great mantra to have. So it kind of coincides with the show title. It also sounds pretty good, in my opinion. Here at the Ono Show, we believe in one thing, and that is capital F football. What does that mean, you might be asking? Well, there's a big debate on social media, probably since before social media even began. What's the real football? Us star-spangled, blooded Americans believe football is football, because it is football. But if you go anywhere else in the world, football is soccer. I know. Crazy, right? Why? That doesn't make any sense at all. So I have come up with a solution. You don't have to worry anymore. You don't have to debate anymore. They can have football. We are capital F football, college football, God's favorite sport. That's completely true. Now that we've got the introduction out of the way, let's jump right into the news. The 14-team playoff is in effect. The committee came out and announced that we're scooting right past 12 teams. We're going to 14. We haven't even seen 12 teams yet. Now, if you already follow me on Twitter, you might have witnessed my debates with people on Twitter, the smartest individuals on the planet, about why the 12-team playoff isn't my favorite thing in the world. You might be thinking, what? How could you ever not like more college football? It's more games. It's home playoff games. I'm a fan of that. I'm a fan of that specific aspect. 12 teams, however, it's not feasible. As it stands currently, at the state of the sport, there will not be 12 capable football teams that are able to win a national championship. Four is perfect. You only really have four. You might use this past year as an example. You could argue some of the teams in the playoff were never going to win the playoff, but that's besides the point. We're skipping right past 12 to 14. So now you have a lot of people kind of waking up to the idea, oh, maybe they don't have the best interest of the sport in mind. Maybe they have the best interest of their wallets in mind. They, of course, being the playoff committee, the NCAA, the conferences, they all agreed to this. In 2026, so we're only going to have 2 years of the 12-team playoff before we get to see the 14-team playoff. Some people are ecstatic about that. Believe what you want to believe. Ignorance is bliss, I guess. Next up in the news, Trev Alberts. You might have heard this. It actually flew under the radar nationally, but Trev Alberts, former athletic director at Nebraska, taking the same position at Texas A&M. This is, funnily enough, coming up at the same time when Nebraska men's and women's basketball is facing Texas A&M in the March Madness tournament. This isn't a basketball social. We'll skip right past that. This actually came as a surprise to a good amount of people. Nebraska just announced a stadium reconstructing a little bit. A massive, massive project, don't get me wrong. Off the back of Trev Alberts being extended by Nebraska, he moves to Texas A&M, and now Nebraska will face Texas A&M. Tony Alford jumps ship from Ohio State to Michigan. Great running back development, great running back coach. He's got experience at Notre Dame, Louisville, Iowa State, Washington, all over the country, West, Central, East Coast, South. And he has officially jumped ship to Michigan. He will be Michigan's new running back coach, the same title he held at Ohio State. Great hire for Michigan to be able to poach from your rival like that. A lot of people are upset about it. We've actually seen that a lot already this offseason. Players, coaches jumping to their rivals more so than I've ever seen in my entire life. This is a huge get for Michigan and Sherrone Moore. And funnily enough, our next segment is a profile of Sherrone Moore for Michigan, new head coach after Jim Harbaugh leaves. He was promoted to head coach after going 3-0. Jim Harbaugh got suspended at the end, at the beginning of the season. He was just suspended. Connor Stallions. You've heard all that. We don't need to reiterate. He's been at Michigan since 2018, formerly an assistant head coach at Central Michigan, no actual head coaching experience, and he's 38 years young. He's a young guy. Now, the promotion of Sherrone Moore to head coach was a huge deal for Michigan because they were able to retain most of their roster. They had staff turnover, not as much as you might get if you go out and hire some random guy from Texas. He brings in Don Martindale, former NFL guy. He worked with the Giants, Ravens, Broncos as a defensive coordinator. Now takes a step down to the collegiate level. Kirk Campbell gets promoted to Sherrone Moore's former position at offensive coordinator. He's been at Michigan since 2022. He's got plenty of experience. He was actually the QB's coach for J.J. McCarthy, who's now projected to be a top 3 round pick. But other than that, the roster turnover wasn't that bad either, surprisingly enough. In this day and age, you see a lot of transfers whenever your coach leaves. You saw it at Alabama, you saw it at Washington. But thankfully enough, if you're a Michigan fan, you didn't see that. You lost Keon Sabb to Alabama. That's probably your biggest loss, and it's not the end of the world. Keon Sabb was really great last year. A lot of production. You lose CJ Stokes and a lot of depth. So you don't love to see that, obviously, but it's inevitable. You lose McCarthy, you lose Corn to the NFL. That's another thing. But for what it is, they didn't do too terribly with roster turnover. Now, what does Sherrone Moore mean for the future at Michigan? Obviously, we don't know. If you want my honest opinion, we'll have to wait and see. But in my opinion, you get to keep your roster intact. You get to keep a lot of your coaches. It's an easier transition. And Sherrone Moore did great in his stint as interim head coach while Jim Harbaugh was suspended. So you hire a lot internally. You move some guys up. Don't lose that many people on your roster. And you get to keep that squad together that just won a national championship. Obviously, you lose a quarterback, you lose a star running back, but you have guys waiting in the wings. Are they going to be in the national title picture this season? Who's really to say? If you look at history, if you look at basically everything we know about college football, probably not. You don't lose your head coach, you don't lose your starting quarterback, you don't lose your starting running back, some offensive linemen to the NFL, and typically make it back to the national championship and repeat. But it's not impossible. Could they be a playoff team? Sure. I'm not actually opposed to that. Michigan could be a playoff team now that it's moved to 12. Using that, we'll transition to our next segment, which is realistic title contenders in 2024. We just talked about Michigan. I don't see them as a realistic title contender. We have 3 teams here. You might think these are obvious, but just hear me out. Number 1, the Georgia Bulldogs. I know, big surprise. They've been in the title picture the last 5 years, but they do lose Bowers. They do lose Amarius Mims, offensive lineman. They lose McConkey, Kamari Lassiter, and Fran Brown. That has gone largely under the radar. Fran Brown takes the job as the Syracuse head coach. A great hire, in my opinion, by Syracuse. So if you look purely on that, Georgia loses a lot of guys. However, Carson Beck is back. He had a great year last year. They bring in Trevor Etienne from Florida, another one of those jumping ship to the rival team that I was talking about earlier. You bring in London Humphreys to replace McConkey, to replace Bowery. Obviously, you can't replace those 2 guys, but London Humphreys was amazing at Vanderbilt last year. And they bring in Travaris Robinson from Alabama. Another example of jumping ship. Now, Georgia and Alabama aren't necessarily the biggest rivals, not on the same level as Georgia, Florida, but it still is very key for Georgia. They lost Fred Brown, who's a great recruiter. They bring in Travaris Robinson, who is also a great recruiter. And with that being said, Kirby Smart is the head coach at Georgia, which means they will be in the picture every year. We've seen it the past 5 years almost that Georgia has just dominated the sport. As long as Kirby's there, they will be there. For the second realistic title contender in 2024, we're going to take a look at Texas. Now, hear me out. They just won the Big 12. They're not going to be in the Big 12 anymore. They're moving to the SEC. That will make it harder. The schedule's going to be harder year in and year out. But they just won the Big 12. They just made it, despite not looking like the absolute favorite from the Big 12. They do lose A.D. Mitchell, Xavier Worthy. Those are two huge losses. Jonathan Brooks, Tavondre Sweat, and Byron Murphy. Those two interior defensive linemen, they're irreplaceable, like I said before about McConkey and Bowers at Georgia. They lose those guys. They're bringing in Ryan Wingo, 5-star wide receiver, Matthew Golden, another great wide receiver from Houston, Colin Simmons, a 5-star defensive end. So you're bringing in a lot of young talent, and you're reloading. If you're Texas, you already have a great roster. You're not talking about Washington, well, especially not now that they've lost Kalen Moore. Although I do feel Jed Fish is a great fit there, and I believe in him. I believe he'll work out at Washington. Washington's not a team that you're going to see every year because they have these windows. They're not a national favorite every year. But Texas, with the roster they have, will always be a favorite as long as they keep Sarkisian, similarly to Smart at Georgia. But Sark is legit. He just proved it this past year. He can put together a squad. He can win as an underdog. He can win as a favorite. He can win. You also have Quinn Ewers coming back, and you have Arch Manning in the wings. You know, who knows how good Arch Manning's going to be. But we know Ewers is a solid guy, probably a first-round quarterback if I had to guess in next year's draft. They also have multiple returning starters on O-line, which is huge. The O-line is arguably the most important part of the team other than the quarterback because they have to protect the quarterback. And when you can return that many starters on your offensive line, that will always be a key factor that leads to success and is one of the biggest strengths for Texas next year. The third and final team we're going to talk about today as a realistic title contender in 2024 is Ohio State. Everybody's seen it. The transfer class is insane. You do lose Kyle McCord to Syracuse. Arguably not a big deal if you're Ohio State, looking at what you got. You do lose Marvin Harrison Jr. That is huge no matter what. Marvin Harrison Jr. may be the best player in college football in the entire sport last year. But you do add Will Howard, who many, including myself, believe is an automatic step up from Kyle McCord. You get Caleb Downs from Alabama, who might be the best defensive player in the sport next season. You get Quinshon Judkins from Ole Miss. You poach him. Nobody saw that coming. Lane Kiffin didn't see it coming, although he doesn't seem to be worried about it. And on top of bringing those guys in, you have Emeka Egbuka coming back. You have Travion Henderson coming back. And on top of all that, you bring in two great quarterbacks, high 4-star Aaron Noland and 5-star Julian Sayin, the transfer technically from Alabama. Obviously, those guys aren't going to make a big impact immediately, probably, but that just encapsulates the kind of offseason that Ohio State has had. They're gearing up for a massive, massive 2024. And Ryan Day feels like he's all in. And it's hard not to say that every year, but last year, choosing to start Kyle McCord and that not really working out to the fullest extent, he was okay. And you lose to Michigan again. It feels easy to kind of bow out and just be like, well, we are what we are. We're the inferior team in the game. Maybe if Michigan is down, we can beat them this year and then possibly make the Big Ten championship, make the playoff. But no, they're going full steam ahead. Michigan just won their national title. That's inexcusable if you're Ohio State. You can't have your rival beating you 3 years in a row and winning a national title, all the while you're losing to Missouri in a sloppy bowl game. That just can't happen. And it feels like Ryan Day is aware of that, and he's locked in. He's all in this year. He's putting all his chips in. And that is why I believe they're the realistic favorite to win the national title this year. For our third and final segment in the inaugural episode of the O&O Show, we're going to end it off with our superlative series. We're going to be doing this every episode up until the beginning of next season. And for our first superlative, most likely to improve in 2024. These are going to be teams that either were decent or good last year that I believe could be great, or teams that stunk it up a little that I believe could be a lot better than they were last year based on the moves they made this offseason. And the first team of three that we're going to have in this segment is Ole Miss, a team we've talked about briefly already in this episode. Now, Ole Miss is coming off a great season, second 10-win season in a row. You might think they've reached their peak, but no, I believe Kiffin has hit his stride. I believe he's improving every year, something you couldn't say in the past. But every year you see an improvement, arguably on both sides of the ball, especially the offensive side. And their transfer class is amazing. I believe it's third on three sports. Walter Nolan, the number one prospect from a year ago from A&M, he's a five-star transfer. I believe he was the number one transfer prospect. You're getting Juice Wells from South Carolina. Great production there. And you get two Washington offensive linemen. Washington just made the national title game. You're getting two of their starting offensive linemen, Julius Buelo and Nate Kalepo. It's hard for me to believe that they won't at least win another 10 games. They might be competing for the SEC if they're able to stay healthy. And that's why I believe they will win at least 10 games again and maybe more, maybe compete for the SEC, playoff berth, national title in the mix at least. The second team, and it is a very controversial team to talk about if you've ever been on social media, it's Miami. Uh-oh. Mario Cristobal, not been that impressive in his first couple seasons at Miami. And there's nothing wrong with that. Miami is a big rebuild. There's been culture problems. There's been recruiting problems, not being able to retain people in the state, letting Florida guys slip away to Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State, all these other teams. Miami's kind of fell off, but that's what you hired Cristobal to come fix. If you've watched Miami football the past couple years, you might see it as just the same old, same old. If you look closely, though, I believe you will see that Cristobal is turning it around. He's got a chip on his shoulder, and they're setting themselves up for a great year next year. And their 2024 schedule isn't awful. You've got Florida, you've got Florida State, and you've got Louisville as your toughest opponents. Other than that, you got Florida A&M, Ball State, Virginia Tech, who could be another team on the rise that we might talk about in the future. You've got South Florida, Cal, Duke. I mean, you're going to have better rosters than most of these teams if you're Miami, other than Florida State, arguably Louisville, and possibly Florida. They were 7-6 last year, lost in a bowl game to Rutgers, I believe. Not the kind of season you want to see, but I believe they're primed for a bounce back, and that is because of Cam Ward, the quarterback transfer. We thought he was going to the NFL. He said, nope, hold up. Coming from Washington State, going to Miami, and he is the biggest game changer, arguably, in all of college sports this year. He's going to make an immediate impact, probably be a Heisman contender if I had to guess. And that's really what Miami's needed. I mean, Tyler Van Dyke was okay. He had a great start to his career and then kind of fell off over the past few years. Now he's at Wisconsin looking for a new start, and you immediately upgrade to one of the best quarterbacks in the sport. He's extremely athletically gifted. He could have gone in the first round of the NFL draft if he stuck with his guns and chose to go to the NFL, but no, he's going to Miami. They went out, they spent the funds, and they got him. That move will be huge for Miami this year, and I believe that move alone is what's going to take them to the next level, competing for an ACC title possibly, winning 9 or 10 games rather than the 7-6 they've been hovering around. So if you're a Miami fan, there's a lot to be excited about next season. And with that being said, the third and final team that I believe will improve in 2024 is USC. USC, another one of the teams that people like to laugh at. Lincoln Riley jumped ship from Oklahoma. People didn't like that. Oklahoma fans definitely didn't like that, but I don't think they mind now. Brent Venables has been good. And people forget how good Lincoln Riley is. He's had awful, awful defenses, and you can say that's his fault. Bad hires, and you're completely right. But that doesn't negate the fact that he's still a great coach. He's a national title caliber head coach. He made it to the playoffs at Oklahoma, and I believe he can get back there at USC, mainly because Alex Grinch is out. And if you're a USC fan, that's bliss to even hear. Alex Grinch was the main reason you sucked it up last year, and you bring in D'Anton Lynn, who has NFL experience as a defensive coach, and last year led a great UCLA defense. Another one of the moves where they jumped to the rival. And I hate it, but that's just the nature of the sport. And if you're USC, and if you're a USC fan, you're just elated at that because not only did you steal a guy from your rival team, but you're also getting a coach who just coached a top 10 defense. If you look at NCAA statistics, top 10 in total defense for UCLA. It's just hard to imagine that they could get worse by adding a guy like that in Deanton Lynn. So, USC fans, fear no more. The bad man, Grinch, is gone, and it is officially in with Lynn. USC, the third team most likely to improve. And if you enjoyed watching this video, please leave a like, please subscribe. It is the inaugural O&O show video. Should be back in the next couple of weeks with the second episode. Follow us on social media at O&O Sports. Follow me on social media at Holton Vetter on all social medias. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.